I've sanded back and polished up a fair few plastic lenses in my time, but I've never done a dedicated video on the subject. So keep it locked to see me attempt to restore some clarity back into a pair of cataract-inflicted Mr. 2 headlights before sealing them up to hopefully prevent them from going bad again. So after bumping into Roger Bailey while out for a summer spin in his 17-year-old MR2, which as an owner of a few fancy Porsches he likes to do from time to stay grounded, noticed that its faded headlights were ruining its freshly repainted vibe, so volunteered my elbow grease for the sake of a video. And although there was a pre-purchased restoration kit handy that I could have technically used on both yellowed lenses, thought I'd also bring one of my own along to try and make things a bit more interesting. Now, before getting to grips with either of the Holts or Cerakote kits, the rough plastic lenses needed to be thoroughly cleaned to ensure they were free from loose dirt, grit and grime. So hose them off before washing them over with a microfibre mitt and some bodywork shampoo. And while this will generally do a decent enough job, a dedicated degrease with something like an all-purpose cleaner agitated over with a detail brush or bug sponge will help take the pre-clean to the next level. But either way, the point is just to try and get the lights and the immediate surrounding area as clean as it all realistically can be before moving on to the restorative stages. So I decided to put the more expensive Cerakote kit to use on the near side headlight first, and while most restoration kits rely on mechanical sanding to remove the layer of dead lacquer, this one comes with a bunch of dedicated oxidation removal wipes which instead aim to chemically cut the crap. It's simply a case of working them over the surface every which way with a gloved hand. And while I've seen plenty of stuff with others showing the wipes quickly discolouring, I didn't get a whole lot of transfer here, which was a bit of a bummer, as it's always nice to have visual confirmation that your elbow grease is actually doing something. But I don't think it was down to them being ineffective, but rather the pre-clean having already done most of the work, as there was definitely some yellowing drawn out with the earlier agitation. But manky discoloration or not, I still ensured I gave this headlight a good going over with a few of the wipes, so I could at least say I'd ticked that box. Now, although this kit primarily utilises chemicals to cut through the oxidation, the subsequently exposed surface does still need to be lightly sanded by hand to smooth it back prior to protecting. So after wiping things down to remove any chemical residue, went ahead and masked up the surrounding paintwork to prevent any cack-handed colour sanding before affixing one of the supplied 2000 grit sanding discs to the handy Cerakote puck, wetting things down with one of Auto Bright Direct's snazzy new Pro 750 bottles, and getting to work sanding the surface in a top to bottom fashion, trying to keep things constantly wet to ensure the abrasive disc didn't get too clogged with the acrylic sludge that doing this quickly creates. Unlike sanding an oxidised headlight right off the bat, all you're really looking to do here is knock back any roughness and remaining spots of stubborn oxidation. And while it might require a tad more muscle than machine or drill sanding, which I'll be honest I'm not a huge fan of on plastic, it's hard to go wrong with finer grade hand sanding like this. And depending on the design of the headlights you're working on, it can sometimes make sense to remove the sanding disc or pad to instead access the edges and corners by hand. So after a quick wipe down, I then moved on to the finer 3000 disc, which is designed to refine and smooth the surface a bit further while leaving a light key for the ceramic protection to grab onto. This time working side to side, as that's generally the recommended approach, although to be honest I'm not so sure, as it can sometimes lead to a crosshatch of sanding marks being left as opposed to them just flowing in one direction. But the layer of ceramic protection you finish this particular process off with will fill any light sanding mark, so don't think it makes much difference. The important thing is just to ensure that all areas have been sufficiently smoothed back. After being hand sanded, the headlight will still look opaque, but as I say, the final protective stage should take care of that. So after being demasked and given one last wipe down to remove any remaining residue, whipped one of the kit's 2 ceramic wet wipes out before carefully working it over the headlight, tending to the edges first, then filling the rest of it in with a simple overlapping side to side approach to ensure it was all adequately covered. And with no subsequent buffing required, as I guess it's self-levelling. Aside from giving it an hour or so to dry, that's pretty much it. But despite being simple, you can see that it still managed to fill the light sanding marks a treat while restoring plenty of clarity. Obviously, it remains to be seen whether Cerakote's guarantee of a lifetime's worth of protection will hold true. But for now at least, the difference between the Cerakoted lens and the untouched one was night and day. So with the first lens restored, it was on to the second one, and with the Holts Kit taking a more traditional approach, a suitable drill is required for use with the supplied 75mm backing plate. Something I'd unfortunately wrongly assumed the Toyota's owner, being one of the biggest sparks on the block, would have to hand, but his days on the tools are long gone, so unless I was to take an ancient cordless or a big old mains item to the plastic headlights, I had to come up with an alternative. So while masking up, decided I'd try my MP9 micro polisher in rotary mode, which first meant trimming the abrasive discs down to fit. Initially at least, the micro polisher approach looked like it might work, but once I cranked it up to an effective speed, soon became apparent that the size and solidness of the backing plate meant it was going to be far too impactful to the plastic and potentially cause the cloudy lens more issues than it already had, not to mention cover the car in unsightly splatter. So jacked that in and decided to basically hybridise both kits by using the Holts abrasive discs with the Cerakote hand puck, as I figured if the other one came up okay with just 2 and 3000 grit discs, then hitting this one with all of the supplied 800, 1000, 1500 and 3000 items before polishing it out should be adequate. Now, to add insult to unprepared injury, just as I was getting to grips with the lower grit hand sanding, my 1500 squid video camera decided it didn't want to record what I was doing anymore, so unfortunately had to switch to a GoPro POV approach for the remainder. And while I do spend a good few minutes on the glitchy app trying to get things properly aligned, the shots rarely come out as the preview leads you to believe they will, so you'll just have to make do with what's presented, but it should still be better than the vast majority of half-arsed, shaky-handed vlog crap that gets dumped here on the daily. Again, it was just a straightforward case of working through the different grades of abrasive disc here, which required a fair bit of elbow grease across the 4 of them, but I figured we're still probably a better approach than assaulting the aging lens with a clunky old power tool, so stuck with it and captured what I could of the multi-stage sanding process to try and give you a good idea of exactly what went down. Finishing up with the fine 3000 grade to leave the surface feeling smooth and looking semi-transparent, ready for the penultimate stage of the restoration, which again would call for the use of the micro polisher. The Holts Kit includes a foam polishing pad to be used in conjunction with the supplied backing plate, but because I couldn't utilise that, went with my own 2-inch spot pad instead, but did pair it at least initially with the supplied compound to begin to knock back the sanding haze and restore some clarity. But unfortunately the gremlins just kept on coming, as the MP9 machine didn't want to play ball in rotary mode and kept cutting out as soon as any light resistance was detected, which I think is a safety feature designed to prevent cack-handed weekend warriors from inflicting unnecessary damage. But was quite frustrating here, as I had no rotary alternative to hand, and knocking sanding marks back without one isn't easy, so definitely had my work cut out here trying to achieve an aftershock worthy finish with the dual action setup instead. It was then the turn of the compound to mess me about by drying out too quickly, and while I was working in the direct summer sun, it still felt very basic. So switched over to a more advanced and lubricious product in the shape of Turtle Wax's One and Done compound, which I actually used on one of my own headlights last year with great success, so steadily worked it over the surface of this near side one, which took a little longer than doing it in rotary fashion would have. And although working in the sun like this isn't ideal, it is good for seeing exactly what you're doing in unforgiving and transparent fashion. But if you're doing this in slightly darker conditions, would advise intermittently flicking the headlights on to check your work, as that will show up every little imperfection. So if you can get the lenses looking good with the lamps on, then they'll almost certainly look great when they're off. With the headlight polished and thoroughly wiped down, it was then remasked up off camera, ready to be protected with Holts aerosol based spray sealant. And while you could be forgiven for thinking it's a dedicated lacquer, it's not, as it needs reapplying from time to time, as well as buffing over afterwards, which a dedicated lacquer wouldn't. But either way, I gave it a couple of quick coats before gently finessing it over with one of the supplied thin towels to level it out and knock back any excess, which seemed to work quite well. Then, aside from demasking and thoroughly wiping down the front end of the car to remove any overspray, splatter and runoff, left it at that, as restoring headlights in this manner isn't supposed to drag on forever. So despite things not exactly going to plan, which I'll be honest, they rarely do when I'm trying to film, the consumer-based kits put to use here, which aim to restore neglected headlights back to an acceptable standard most will be happy with, seem to do just that. There was still some micro fracturing within the plastic, tainting the fresh transparent finish, but that unfixable defect just serves to illustrate why it's important to try and deal with oxidised headlights sooner rather than later. I like the fact the Cerakote Kit was truly self-contained and required no machine sanding or polishing. However, you will pay a premium for that convenience factor. And despite bastardising the more traditional Holts one here, it still served to leave the lens looking a damn sight better than before. Now, from a professional perspective, removing the headlights, then treating them to an orbital machine sand with something like 3M Trizact or Rupes X-Cut foam abrasive discs, followed by a rotary polish, will help take them to the next level, as will having a body shop sand, re-lacquer, flat and polish them. But whatever process you choose, it's important to keep freshly restored lenses topped up with some form of UV absorbing protection to help slow or eliminate future degradation, especially if they're regularly exposed to the sun. So while not one of my finest uploads to date, I still thought you might be interested in seeing my struggles with Bailey's Modest MR2 and the results they brought about. But before you give up and get off, much like I did here, let me know your experience with headlight restoration kits or your preferred approach to tackling neglected lenses. And in return, I'll ensure that next time I catch it, I'll definitely have the right tools and products to hand, as well as hopefully a working video camera.